Well, welcome everyone to this Forest Fuels webinar on why burning wood for energy is accelerating climate change and damaging health, and what we as the environment and clean air sector can do about it. I'm Larissa Lockwood, the Director of Policy and Campaigns at Global Action Plan, and we're running this webinar today in partnership with Biofuelwatch. And Biofuelwatch is one of the few organisations who've been working tirelessly and consistently to bring this issue of burning forest fuels to the attention of the public and decision makers. And I think that is one of the issues for us to think about today. It shouldn't just be a few organisations talking about this issue. It needs to be all of us talking about forest fuels, just as we do fossil fuels. You may wonder why Global Action Plan's involved, and it's been a journey. We are an environmental charity, and one of our goals is to phase out the burning of fossil and forest fuels in urban areas by 2030, so that we can all breathe clean air and tackle climate change. So we actually started looking at burning wood from a health perspective, as the air pollution emissions from wood-burning stoves from people's homes have doubled over the last 10 years, such that burning wood has become a real public health problem, especially in our towns and cities. And then through this work on domestic burning, we became aware of the really horrific air pollution and climate impacts of industrial wood burning or industrial biomass in places in the UK like Drax and Lynmouth power stations, which then led us to the excellent work of the likes of Biofuelwatch, the Stop Burning Trees Coalition, Cut Carbon Not Forests, and the National Resource Defence Council. So we're holding this event today because tomorrow is the UN's International Day of Forests. And because while as a sector we talk about climate change, we talk about nature, we talk about trees and the need to plant more trees, what we talk much less about is the burning of trees. And this feels like a mistake. I think we need to talk about burning trees if we want to tackle the climate crisis. For in short, burning wood is worse for climate change than burning fossil fuels, and it's bad for public health. So that's what we want to talk about today. And of course, there are nuances to what I've just said, we'll discuss. But while attention has rightly focused on eradicating fossil fuels, and like others, I've been working on that since the late 90s, we must also ensure that fossil fuels are not simply replaced by forest fuels, because burning wood at scale cannot be considered carbon neutral. It's not really a renewable energy source and should not be considered a transition fuel towards a clean energy future. These are strong statements, I know, which is why I'm glad to be here today with experts and campaigners in the field who can tell us more about the evidence behind this and to expose the true scale of the forest fuel problem in the UK. You'll hear shortly from Professor Bill Moomore, a renowned climate academic and policy expert, Katie Brown from Biofuelwatch, Matt Williams from the Natural Resources Defence Council, and Chloe Cools from Global Action Plan. And I think we should see this webinar as a call to action to the environment and health sectors who are represented today to do more about the growing problem of burning fossil fuels. This is deliberately an invite-only event, so it should feel like a safe space to explore this problem openly and to share what we are and are not doing and what we could be doing together to build on the work of what's been going on by the likes of Biofuelwatch, Cut Carbon Not Forests, etc. So with this new government, we really have an opportunity to stop the burning of both forest as well as fossil fuels, and we've got to make the most of that. So what I'd love everyone to get out of the meeting today is to firstly learn something new about the problem of burning wood, secondly to feel compelled to share something that you've learnt with others tomorrow on International Day of Forests, and to take that conversation back into your organisations, and thirdly, to take more action towards phasing out the burning of forest fuels in the UK and globally as soon as possible, both personally and in our organisations. Quick bit of housekeeping before we start. We are recording the presentations in this webinar to then enable us to share the content more widely. What we won't be recording or sharing is the comments or the conversation. That remains between us. We do have a lot to cover in a short space of time, so I'm going to suggest that we listen to all the speakers before going into verbal questions and discussion. However, if you do have clarification questions, please feel free to write them in the Q&A function. In that way, they'll get to the speakers, and perhaps once you finish speaking, speakers, if you wouldn't mind sort of answering some of those questions in the Q&A there, so that we can then have a sort of conversation at the end. Right, enough from me. With no further ado, let's get started with our first speaker. Delighted that we are joined by Professor Bill Mumel, who is an Emeritus Professor of International Environmental Policy and is the founding director at the Centre for International Environment and Resource Policy at Tufts University. And amongst a very distinguished career, Bill has been a lead author of 5 major IPCC reports. So Bill, over to you.
I think everyone is aware that the UK this past few months made an announcement that as the initiator of the Industrial Revolution and the burning of coal in 1750 or thereabouts, they now announced that they were no longer burning any coal, and they were very proud of that. So what have they done with all of this huge capital investment in big old coal plants? They've decided to burn forests, burn the wood from our forests in them instead, and to claim that it's carbon neutral, and to claim that it's a good thing. Well, let me just give a little background. If forests have been removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere since the end of the last ice age, when forests reappeared in the northern hemisphere, the amount removed has been in the neighborhood of just under 30% of our emissions. In other words, the amount removed from the atmosphere every year is about 30% of what we're putting in from burning fossil fuels. And if that were not the case, current carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere today would have occurred in 1960. And today, the concentrations in the atmosphere would be something like 540 parts per million instead of 424 or whatever it is. So that's probably unlivable, by the way, that amount. Forests have been helped by the oceans that have removed another 25%. So in point of fact, the increase every year is less than half of what we put in, thanks to the natural world. Forests, a little bit from wetlands and other grasslands and other things, but primarily it's forest on land that are doing the job. So what happens when we replace burning coal with burning wood? Well, at the stack, to get the same amount of electricity, one has to burn more wood and release more carbon dioxide than we burn from coal. In other words, the emissions from burning wood to produce 1 kilowatt hour of electricity is greater than the carbon dioxide released from burning coal. So why is this a good deal? Well, the argument is that forests will grow back, and therefore in growing back, will remove the same amount of carbon dioxide as was emitted. All right, let's examine that for a moment. The forest does not grow back instantaneously. If one harvests let's say a 40-year-old forest, if all goes well, in 40 years, it will have removed that amount of carbon dioxide, and it can be claimed that it was eventually carbon neutral. But eventual carbon neutrality is not the same as climate neutrality. Because during that period while the trees are growing, if they grow, by the way, there's no guarantee they'll grow. There's no guarantee the forest will grow back. That's just an assumption that it will happen. That's like saying, if I get a better job than I have now that pays more money, I'll be richer when I'm 40 years, 50 years from now, 40 years from now than I am now. Well, maybe you will be and maybe you won't be, but there's no guarantee that that forest will grow back. But let's assume it does. And so the claim of carbon neutrality is eventual carbon neutrality. And here's why that's not the same as climate neutrality. Climate neutrality would be an action that does not affect the climate in any way. It doesn't make it worse. It doesn't make it better, but it prevents it from getting worse. So things like wind, electricity from wind power or from solar power are in that category. They give us the electricity that we all need and want, but without changing any of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that is trapping the heat and making the Earth get warmer. Um, so so we're faced with a situation where the claim is being made that is false in terms of climate. It is not climate neutral. It is not. It is actually adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere than if we had burned coal. And if we had let the forest keep growing and burn coal, those forests would be removing carbon dioxide for those 40 years, additional carbon dioxide. So it's a doubly destructive action to burn wood from forest. It emits more carbon dioxide when it burns, and we lose the removal that those forests would be doing at 40 compared to what they'll be doing at 1 year from now, let's say. I hope that's clear because that's very much misrepresented in all of the claims. The other thing about burning wood is that the UK does not have enough wood to make much difference. I think all the growth from I think you've started growing 2 national forests in the last couple of decades, as I recall, and what that means is that that's a good thing to do, but planting trees take a very long time before they are removing very much carbon dioxide. So I think the UK could probably, if they used your own forest, would probably use them all up within a decade if generating electricity the way you are now. Perhaps a bit longer, but it's not very. You don't have much. So where does this wood come from? It comes from North America, and from most of it from the Southeast United States, which has been the most biodiverse set of hardwood forests and pine forests in North America. However, many of those have now been cut down and converted into plantations of faster growing trees, which are then cut down, ground up, turned into wood pellets, shipped by truck and train to the coast, put on a ship, and going whatever it is, 4,000 miles to the UK, where it's unloaded, goes onto a train, and goes to the big Drax power plant and other plants in the UK. How in the world that can be considered climate neutral or carbon neutral anyway, even carbon neutral, is beyond me, because the emissions from all that processing is greater than the emissions from processing coal. So both in burning and in processing, there are more emissions coming from burning wood than burning coal and processing it. Both, they all add up. And as a result, we're losing. Here's the kicker. Under international rules, the UK can legally count those emissions in the energy sector as zero. And they're counted in the land sector where the forests were cut, which is North America. So our emissions go up when you in the UK burn our wood under the accounting system. That's bizarre. Many of us in the scientific community are trying to get that rule changed, but it seems that there's a little objection to doing that because the EU is doing exactly the same thing. Now, in 2014, when I first met people from Biofuelwatch, I was in the UK, and they'd arranged for me and some other people to meet members of Parliament and members of the government. And was able to meet with I can't remember what the name of the agency was at that time. They keep changing the names, but it was the agency that was looking after climate and energy. And the staff director was there, and all their people were there, and I was allowed to make my presentation. And at the end of it, the lawyer said, "But Dr. Mumma, you do not understand. and this is when the UK was part of the EU, by the way. We cannot meet our obligations to the European Union to reduce our emissions if we don't burn biofuels. And I've heard the same thing from the leadership of the European Union, by the way. And the reason for that is the obligation is to reduce fossil fuels rather than to reduce carbon dioxide emissions. And so it is just a bizarre decision that was made. And I don't know what the percentage is in the UK, but I know in the EU, it is 60% of renewable energy is burning other people's wood and other biofuels from crops. So in the UK, it's probably comparable. Although you have much more wind, offshore wind and things like that, which is a good thing. But it's a high percentage of your renewables is from burning wood and counting it as zero, which you're allowed to do. But the atmosphere doesn't believe you, and the climate doesn't believe you. So we need to really work to get that changed. It just is such an anomalous thing to have done, and the scientific community, my colleagues who work on climate, have been trying for years, and we can give you all the information you need. So we need the action of the organizations that are really working on this. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to get this off my chest.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you for explaining that so clearly, because it has always sat really uncomfortably with me as a climate campaigner that it's just okay to chop down trees, the very things that are supposed to be sucking up the carbon.
Right.
And there's international carbon accounting. It blows my mind. It's so wrong. So please tell us what we can do to support with that. I know there's been letters from sort of hundreds of academics to the EU asking them to change the definition of wood as a renewable energy source and so on. Whatever we can do as a movement, send actions our way. This is definitely something we need to do a lot more on together.
Right.
So thank you very much for that very clear explanation.
Thank you.
And if people have questions, do put them in the Q&A. I'm sure Bill would be happy to answer them. I'm now going to ask, invite our next speaker, Katie Brown from Biofuelwatch, who's a very knowledgeable and experienced biomass campaigner. Maybe you were one of the ones that Bill met and was inspired by a few years ago now. Who's going to talk a bit more about the problem of burning wood for fuel in the UK context and perhaps bring some of the stories that Bill mentioned to life as well. I know you've got some nice images and so on, and really what some of the international consequences are of our UK burning habits. Thank you, Katie.
Yeah. Thanks, Bill, and thanks everyone for coming. So yeah, Bill's already mentioned Drax, the #1 offender. Hang on, how do I move this panel? Sorry. Which many of you will have heard of. Was formerly burning coal and now is converted to burning wood. Why could it not have closed down like many of the others? And it's the world's biggest tree burner. It's the UK's single largest carbon emitter. And the latest figures available for 2023, where they burnt 13 million tons of carbon. It's clearly there in their annual report, reported as biogenic carbon, like as if it's this kind of magic carbon that, doesn't affect the climate. But as Bill has said, of course it does. That, you can play magic tricks, but you can't stop carbon being carbon in the atmosphere. The wood, primarily comes from North America, whether that's the US Southeast or Canada. Also, some wood does come from Estonia and Latvia, and everywhere they source their wood, it harms forests, it harms the animals that live there, it harms the people who live near them. There's not really any good outcomes. And there's I've just realised the discrepancy on my figure there. It says 11 million, but I think it's 13 million. Linemouth is a smaller, exactly the same as Drax, but smaller in the northeast. As Bill says, in the southern US, which is where the majority of the wood pellets come from, they're sourced from clear cuts. They say that they source from, you know, sawmill residue and offcuts and waste wood. Sometimes their definition of waste wood is a tree that, you know, doesn't grow straight, so it can't be used, you know, for furniture. But if you're the owl that lives in that tree, there's nothing wrong with your tree. It's a perfectly good tree, and it should stay there so that you can live in it. You know, and there's endangered species in these areas, but you know, from where I'm coming from, it doesn't matter what species. It's the homes of the animals that live there, and they're, you know, being chopped down for this mythical achieving of net zero, which is, you know, a paper exercise. Also, I wish I could move that. The impacts on communities. If we've got time, I'm going to show a short film about this, but in the southern US, and it's exactly the same areas where the cotton plantations were, environmental justice communities where the majority are poor and Black are the main sites of the pellet mills that supply Drax, Drax's own pellet mills, and a company called Enviva. And the health issues that the people suffer near those mills are awful. People can't breathe. The dust from the pellets causes asthma, heart disease, a whole litany of health problems. And literally people don't feel they can go out of their houses because the air is so polluted. They've been in trouble for violating air pollution limits, and this doesn't quite fit, but they've violated environmental regulations. I think it's like 11,000 times within a sort of decade period. So these are not one-off incidents. They are systematically polluting the air that these people breathe, and they quite simply don't care. Their response to being fined is to try and increase these environmental limits so that they can just carry on polluting. And the fines that they receive are a drop in the ocean compared to the subsidies they receive, which we'll come on to later. They also source from British Columbia in Canada, and they have been uncovered repeatedly sourcing from primary and old growth forests. BBC Panorama did an investigation in 2022 that found this, which has been the subject of huge controversy. Ofgem investigated and found that they've been misreporting. They had a slap on the wrist voluntary fine of 25 million against again a drop in the ocean. And there's a report by KPMG that it's the subject of much kind of public interest that hasn't been released. And there's actually currently there's a tribunal taking place against an employee who whistle-blew against Drax, and there's a lot of evidence coming out there of just how bad their wrongdoing was throughout that period. And it's very telling that since then they've been investigated again by Panorama, by ourselves at Biofuelwatch, an organisation called Conservation North, and literally like last month the BBC again has found that they're still misreporting the sourcing, and they're still sourcing from primary forests. It's just their business model is to chop down forests, and they will end up chopping down perfectly healthy forests in the process. And in the southern US, where they are claiming to use sawdust residues, etc., like as in Canada, people have followed the trucks to the pellet mills, and it's whole trees that are coming from clear cuts that are going to be pelletized and shipped over to the UK. Here in Europe as well, supposedly protected Natura 2000 sites in Estonia are being chopped down, and this is just kind of, you know, closer to home, and the wildlife there is being affected.
Sorry, it's me. Just to give you a couple of minutes warning.
Oh yeah, no, there's not
make sure we can bring him back too.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, money, the energy that Drax produces classed as renewable, and so to add insult to injury, they are given renewable energy subsidies to subsidise this wood burning, subsidies that we feel should not be going to burning wood. It's a disaster, as we've heard. Drax has a lot of political influence, and we'll see that some of the outcome of that. They've had a lot of meeting time with politicians, and they've had access to politicians much more than those of us campaigning against what they do, and they've been able to have considerable influence, and I think convince politicians that they are necessary to the problem of how to reach net zero, which we don't believe is the case. There's lots of benefits of transferring the renewable subsidies away, for all of the reasons that we've said, and that money can then be made available for genuine non-emissive climate solutions like wind and solar, insulating homes, and these would create a lot more jobs than just burning wood. Oh, that's I think I'm done. That's for the end, the questions, unless there's anything specific. Yeah, so on to
Katie.
On to Matt. And yeah, there is, if we have time, there's a short video that we could show with some of the voices of the people who are impacted by the pellet mills, but we'll let everyone have their chance to speak first, I think. Thank you.
And we will share the slides afterwards and the video if we don't get onto it, because it is really, really powerful. It's what really brought me into this, because the air pollution impacts around those pellet factories are horrendous, as well as the deforestation. Great. Okay, on to Matt. Matt Williams is our next speaker. He's a senior forest protection advocate for the Natural Resources Defence Council. I sort of feel you have a foot over both sides of the ocean, Matt. But Matt is a policy expert on industrial biomass who will share some insights on the policy landscape and influencing opportunities.
Thanks, Larissa, and thanks to Global Action Plan for organising this, and to Katie and Dr. Moonmore for speaking as well. Yeah, so NRDC, for those who haven't heard of it, it's a very large US environmental organisation. I'm based over here in the UK, and I work solely on this issue of UK and European imports of biomass from US and Canadian and European forests to the UK to be burned in our power stations. And I've been working on bioenergy and on this issue for 13 years now. And I think it's important just to bear in mind a bit of history, which started even before I began working on it, which is to go back to the 2000s, to around 2008 or 9, when the UK was still a member of the European Union and was trying to achieve 2020 targets that had been set for all EU member states to get a certain percentage of their electricity from renewables. And alongside wind and solar, there were, as Dr. Moonmore was referring to, there were lots of power stations that were still burning huge amounts of coal at the time. And it looked like a really easy and simple fix to help achieve that target as well, to simply switch those power stations from burning coal to burning wood, and conveniently to say that that wood was carbon neutral. And we've heard all the reasons why burning wood that comes from other countries' forests is not carbon neutral, and in the short term and the medium term, and even decades to centuries, actually increases the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere rather than reducing it. But for the UK government, and for many companies, they simply get to look the other way, say that it's zero carbon when it's burned in our power stations, and claim the benefit. Now, we've heard a lot about the impacts of bioenergy, so I'm not going to repeat all of that. That's already been really well covered. But I think it's really important to say that Drax and Lynmouth, the two major power stations in the UK that are burning this stuff, have subsidy contracts that currently run up until 2027, and they've received and will continue receiving hundreds of millions of pounds every single year up until at least 2027, and we now know beyond. And that adds up to billions of pounds in total, all of which comes from our energy bills. And what they're burning is millions of tons of wood every single year from the US, Canada, Latvia, Estonia, and a few other forests in other countries. In 2023, which is the most recent year that we have the data for, we know that Drax burned just shy of 6 million tons of wood that it imported from forests in those countries. And that devastates forests in those areas, which include a global biodiversity hotspot in the US Southeast, the boreal forest in Canada, a huge carbon store home to billions of birds of hundreds of different species, and old growth forests in Estonia and Latvia. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the policy situation and about the changes to it in recent weeks, even because there's been some quite big changes in recent weeks. Up until recently, there's been nothing, I would say, but unwavering government support for this technology and industry, and ongoing harm to people's health, to the climate, and to forests. And the two kind of roles that bioenergy has been promoted for is, number one, power generation. We've reached the point where electricity from those two power stations, burning wood, provides about 5% of our electricity every year. And also the claim that if you were to add carbon capture technology to those power stations, then they would provide so-called negative emissions that can offset greenhouse gases from other bits of our economy, like flying or farming, for example. Now, there's lots of analysis, including a report that we published last year called the Beck's Hoax, which shows that that's completely untrue for the reasons Dr. Moomore explained, that in fact you don't get any negative emissions by burning trees from other countries' forests. You actually increase emissions between now and 2050. But we've reached the point now where a huge share of the UK's progress towards net zero is at the moment going to rely on those fake negative emissions from bioenergy, and where a large part of our electricity comes from it. I'm glad to say that a growing number of UK NGOs are recognising this issue and working on it, like Global Action Plan, RSPB, Greenpeace, the Wildlife Trusts, Wildlife and Countryside Link, to name just a few. And I hope that even more will work on it in future. And there's plenty of evidence that the UK doesn't need any biomass for electricity. There's fantastic research in recent months and years from EMBA think tank, from E3G, from the University of Oxford, showing that we can produce enough electricity while significantly reducing our reliance on large-scale biomass, possibly even to zero. And even if you did assume that biomass was carbon neutral, and that you could somehow generate negative emissions from it by adding carbon capture technology, there's other research which shows that we don't actually need that to achieve net zero in the UK. And there's a critical report called Beyond BECCS, which the RSPB and WWF commissioned and published in 2023. But I would say that I think things are beginning to change, and this is the final point I'll make, and I'll just cover this in the last couple of minutes, which is that the UK government's long-running, unwavering support for bioenergy is beginning to look a bit shaky. So the last government, the Conservatives, before our general election, consulted on whether to keep giving these power stations renewable energy subsidies, low carbon subsidies after 2027. Since then, we've had a general election, and the Labour government has decided that it is going to halve the amount of electricity that Drax and Lynmouth will be allowed to produce in return for those subsidies, which should in turn roughly halve the subsidies and the amounts of wood that they burn up until 2031. Now, we're not out of the woods. The government says it wants to consult on whether biomass is sustainable. It wants to be sent any evidence on the carbon impacts of burning wood from forests, and it'll be conducting an independent review of whether bioenergy with carbon capture should play any role at all. But what happens after 2031? We don't know. The reliance on bioenergy could go back up to its previous levels, to its current levels. The problem for the government is the UK's net zero target and the legally binding carbon budgets, and pretending that biomass is carbon neutral is pretty convenient for helping to achieve those targets. The other change, I would say, is the advice of the Climate Change Committee, which previously has built in huge amounts of bioenergy with carbon capture to achieve those carbon budgets. In its most recent 7th carbon budget advice just a couple of weeks ago, it roughly halved the role that bioenergy with carbon capture will play in offsetting emissions from other bits of the UK's economy. So it hasn't gone far enough, but it has gone some way towards reducing that role. But I learned recently that it's only done that by changing its accounting methodology and changing the way that it counts carbon from farming and peatlands, and now thinks that the emissions from those sectors are smaller than it previously thought they were, and that means that we don't need as much offsetting from that BECCS technology. And the other key thing that the Climate Change Committee said in those numbers, which it's never said before, is that by 2050, it thinks the UK should not be importing any biomass at all. But there is still a role for bioenergy, and it thinks that that should be completely fueled by biomass that comes from within the UK. And that's a lot more biomass than we're producing in the UK today. So I hope that UK NGOs, which I think this webinar is mostly aimed at, will work on this issue increasingly in the coming years, not just because the UK is a champion of protecting other countries' forests, but because the Climate Change Committee's recommendations make it all the more urgent and suggest that if Drax and Lynmouth are still producing electricity from biomass by 2050, then they will only be burning biomass from within the UK and not imports. And that they could be burning their way through crops grown on UK farmland and through the UK's woodlands.
That's a good place to stop. Thank you, Matt, and a good challenge to us as a sector to get more involved in this. There's a lot of new information here for people today, but then we will at the end look at what we can do about it. Thank you very much. Really insightful, and thank you for the work you've been doing on this over the last 13 years as well. Right, we're now going to shift from the industrial burning of wood to the residential burning of wood, because for many years we've thought of burning logs in a fire as a rural pursuit with little harm, but that trend has somewhat grown, especially in urban areas, and is becoming a significant public health problem, especially in our towns and cities, as well as being a problem for the climate. So I'm delighted to welcome my colleague, Chloe Cools, our Communication Campaigns Manager in the Clean Air team at Global Action Plan, to talk us through this before we move into the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Larissa. Yes, as Larissa said, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the domestic wood burning problem. We can move on to the next slide, please. Great. So to kick us off, what do we mean by domestic burning? It's the burning of wood and other solid fuels in the home for heat. There's a range of appliances people use to do this, from open fireplaces to closed stoves. Perhaps the most relevant when we talk about air quality as an issue in an urban context is eco-design stoves, which were introduced in 2017 and are exempt from smoke control areas, areas where there are limitations on what and how you can burn in England. It's hard to quantify exactly how much wood is being burnt domestically in the UK, but estimates from DEFRA suggest that in 2018 to 19, UK households burned around 2.4 million tonnes of wood fuel. So it's not insignificant quantities. Despite the fact that large quantities of wood are being burned, a relatively small proportion of households are actually burning in the UK. And of those households, just 8% do so out of necessity. These are mainly rural households who don't have an alternative. You might assume it's happening mainly in rural areas, but actually over twice as many people who burn live in urban areas in the UK, where the vast majority of people have another form of heating. So why are people burning? We see that the main reason why people choose to burn is for lifestyle or aesthetic reasons. So creating a homely feel comes through as a really strong motivator. There's also a lot of confusion about the costs and benefits of burning. So many people think it might save them money or be more eco-friendly, despite growing evidence to the contrary of that. Next slide, please. So why is it an issue? We've already heard lots about the environmental cost and some of the health costs of burning wood, but in the home specifically, it presents a range of risks. It's one of the largest sources of fine particle air pollution, called PM2.5 in the UK, and it's the most polluting way to heat your home. I'll go on to talk about the health effects in a little bit, but it's also a notable source of carbon emissions, as we've heard, and due to its inefficiency, the emissions can be higher on a per unit of energy basis than fossil fuels. Many people think it's cheaper, but it's actually almost always the most expensive way to heat your house, as well as there being significant health-related costs to society as a whole. Next slide, please. So this graphic shows data from the Chief Medical Officer's 2002 report on air pollution, and it just demonstrates that even homes using the newer eco-design stoves that are meant to be cleaner are 3 times more polluted than those without a wood-burning stove in terms of PM2.5 pollution. So what does this PM2.5 pollution mean for our health? Next slide, please. So PM2.5 is one of the most concerning types of air pollution for our health. There's a range of health impacts that are linked to, and they're felt by those burning, but also those living nearby to people who are burning. So it's linked to lung and heart diseases, lung cancer, and premature mortality. There's estimates that it causes at least 40,000 premature deaths annually in Europe, and studies out of the US have linked wood stove and fireplace usage with lung cancer, reductions in lung function in asthma patients, and increased airway inflammation, even in people without asthma. We see that indoor exposure to smoke from wood burning is linked to a 43% increase in lung cancer risk. So there's quite a significant toll that this takes on lung health. But more broadly, PM2.5 also causes diabetes. It also damages brain health and leads to dementia, and it can affect the health of unborn children and throughout your life. The good news is that tackling air pollution from wood burning can have really immediate health benefits. So studies have found that reducing wood burning air pollution has led to lower rates of respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. So there is real impetus for us to be tackling this issue. Next slide, please. Bill has already done a great job, and the other speakers, of explaining some of the carbon impacts. But as we now know, when wood is burned, the carbon that was stored in trees for decades or even centuries is released in just a few minutes, and it takes decades or centuries for that carbon to be reabsorbed. In the meantime, it's driving climate change. On the domestic side of things, domestic wood burning is generally less efficient than in an industrial context, and there's a range of reasons for that, from water content of the wood to inefficient combustion practices. As a result, burning wood in the home has higher per unit of energy emissions than fossil fuels, like oil or gas. The carbon emissions from wood burning in the home are quite hard to estimate, and they do depend a lot on how the wood is sourced and managed. So, for example, local wood is going to have lower carbon emissions than wood that's been imported. Despite this, the carbon payback period of wood burning domestically and industrially is not included in our reporting. Next slide, please. There's a range of impacts on nature as well. So while good forest management does involve the thinning of trees to promote biodiversity, the large and growing demand for wood as fuel poses a risk to biodiversity through logging of natural forests and single species timber plantations being grown, which can't support the diversity of life that natural forests can. As Bill said, the UK is already one of the most deforested countries in Europe, so we can't really sustain demand for wood fuel locally, especially as it rises. As a result, we're seeing a growing amount of wood being imported for burning in the home, mainly from Eastern Europe, which would lead to higher carbon impacts. Next slide, please. There are also claims that wood burning is cheaper, but as I've already mentioned, those claims are based on unrealistically low assumptions about the cost of wood. So we've commissioned research with Impact on Urban Health to understand the true cost of wood burning. And we found that wood burning is almost always more expensive than other forms of heating. The only scenario where wood burning is cheaper is when the wood is free, such as like foraged wood or waste wood. But in urban areas where most people are burning, foraged wood is not readily available or sustainable as a source. And in waste wood burning, we see that can be extremely toxic as well due to the way that's treated. Next slide, please.
I'm going to give you a 2-minute warning, Chloe.
No worries. Great. So all of those problems, contribute to the issue. We see that wood burning is growing. So the PM 2.5 emissions from domestic burning in the UK have increased over time. There was a 12% increase from 2012 to 2021. Eco-design stoves represent a relatively small proportion of PM 2.5 emissions in the UK, but because they can be legally installed in many urban areas, their emissions have grown quite rapidly. So in the 5 years since they were introduced, they've grown to be equivalent to those from all English power stations. And we estimate, based on industry data, that more than 1 million stoves could be installed by 2028, in addition to the existing 1.5 million stoves. So this is really a growing issue in the UK, driven by trends, lack of awareness, and policy loopholes, which we'll talk about a bit more. Next slide, please. Great. So this graph just demonstrates that the eco-design stove PM 2.5 emissions are now kind of comparable to those of power stations in the UK. So it's quite a dramatic rise. Next slide, please. My colleague will put some links in the chat if you'd like to find out a little bit more about the work we're doing on this issue. But it's mainly in two strands. We're raising awareness and trying to shift social norms through Clean Air Night. And we're also demonstrating a policy pathway to phase out wood burning in urban areas across England. So there's lots of key moments to be doing this, to be demonstrating those policies. There's a review of the Environment Improvement Plan, which is happening right now. There's also the government's air quality strategy, which we're expecting to be developed over the next 2 years. And we're also expecting a consultation on domestic burning this summer, as well as things like Clean Air Night and Clean Air Day, which are great opportunities to be really raising the profile of these issues and demonstrating public support. So anything you can do to be calling for policy change at those moments would be a big help. Our policy pathway has been popped in the chat, as well as links to find out more about Clean Air Night. So please do go away and have a look at those things. And if there are any questions, then let us know.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Chloe. And yeah, it's an interesting topic, the domestic burning one. It sort of sits slightly uncomfortably for many of us, I think. So we've thought for so long that sort of burning wood in the home is a nice and natural thing to do. But the scale it's now at, it has become a serious public health problem. And something for us as a sector to really think about. Right, so on to actions. Before we start talking, Sarah, if you wouldn't mind clicking on a couple of slides. There should be a list of lovely things to do. Somebody has asked a question why we're focusing more on the problem and less on solutions. In part, it's because I think a lot of this information is new to a lot of people, different elements of it. So it's making sure that everyone's kind of on the same page. And this is the beginning, I think, of that conversation and the work together. So what can be done from this point on? Tomorrow is the International Day of Forests. We will send a comms pack that you could then use in your personal communications, but ideally your organizational communications to share information about the problem and what can be done. There is a live e-action to write to your MP about burning wood. It's Biofuelwatch's e-action. Again, we'll send the link to this. Katie, feel free to put it in the chat as well right now. If you like to get as many people writing to your MPs about this, it is a live topic. The subsidies, while they sort of have in principle been agreed, there's still potential for it not to fully go ahead, maybe, hopefully, if we make enough noise. So let's have a go at that. And also to organise to make sure that they're not renewed after 2031. That's absolutely critical. There will be work going on around the domestic burning consultation. So on the sort of residential wood burning, feel free to sort of get in touch with, get on Global Action Plan's mailing list, and we can sort of give you some text to then get involved in that consultation as well. And any interactions you're having with your MPs and through your campaigning, I think it's starting to talk about not just fossil fuels, but fossil and forest fuels. I think if we can all just start using that language universally, that would be very helpful. And join the NGO Bioenergy group, and we'll send follow-up details on how to do that. Matt's very involved in that. So please do sign up for that. Is there? Sorry to have to end this. It's been so insightful, and it does feel like we really need to keep this conversation going. So please do join the NGO Bioenergy group. We will send links to all the things that you can get involved with after this, and a comms pack for tomorrow. Because remember, tomorrow is International Day of Forests. That means you have to do something with the knowledge that you've gleaned today. So please do. And finally, before everyone pops off to another meeting, just a big thank you all for turning up today, for having this conversation, hopefully to take it back to your organisations and do something with it, come back together and mobilise. And a massive thank you to our speakers, to Bill, to Katie, to Matt and Chloe, not just for sharing your insights today, but all the work that you're doing, truly. Enjoy the trees tomorrow, everyone, and thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It's been a privilege to be with all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for hosting.